Okay. Hello, 4th of October. This and that. Um, I put something up in Daily Kos. Daily Kos is an interesting day today. I probably am going to rant about it during after hours. I put up well, I'll talk about that in in after hours. Anyway, I put up something on game theory, and don't go all numb on us. There was an article in the Financial Times today, or well, actually, it's been up a while, and I don't read the Financial Times regularly. That's kind of a Feldo deal. He can afford it. I can't. They have a little game that they put on their site. It's not paywalled, and it gives you a chance to do different speculation about the swing states in the election, and you can engage it, put in your preferences, and then submit it. And the one you see right here, I tweeted it just for my usual reasons over there. Also, because I was annoyed about certain other things over at Daily Kos, but whatever. Things are changing over there, and that's sort of interesting as well. Anyway, it's a little online site where you can engage in what's called a blotto game. And it's a kind of old game in one sense. It's a certain type of a way in which you can, well, it has a queuing theory built into it and a variety of other things. But essentially, what you're doing is you're trying to speculate on what is the model for swing states. It's going to allow someone to win, and it doesn't matter on the candidate on the one hand. On the other hand, the election is an election about electoral states, electoral college states, and it allows you to sort of play with it online. It's a simple game. I mean, well, it's and it's an old style of game, but needless to say, and because it has an amusing name called Colonel Blotto, it allows me to be didactic in the sense that this is a teaching game because it can be used in all kinds of ways. And I included a on when I put it up in Daily Kos just a couple hours ago. I added a well, I can show that too. Wait a second. How can I show that? Well, we may go there afterwards, and we can actually play the game. The site has linked, can you mastermind a U.S. presidential campaign? Compete for the White House against other readers in the election game. So it's the British tabloid, I assume. Well, I don't think they'd call it a tabloid, but it is the Financial Times of London. And it allows me to talk about other game theoretic elements. I decided when I wrote my little thing over at Coast that I would include applying the Blotto game to the war in Ukraine. So I did a little thing there, and it really the only difference in the Blotto game is that essentially the sides are matched relatively closely, but the difference, of course, or one variable is the amount of Western aid that's going into Ukraine. And of course, as Gemini treated it, well, there are other variables and blah, 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 blah. So, it treated it relatively neutral. So that's fine. I just wanted to show that this has lots of relevance for everyday activity. And it allows me to talk today in this and that about other things I've been working on since we finally got to the end of my marathon reading of the 29, well, only 20 of the 29 chapters of Michael Hudson's book about parasitic capitalists. Anyway, and so this is actually related in the sense that much of the contention in a market or in markets is exactly this kind of thing about questions of dominance, questions of speculation, questions of resources. All of those things are there. And so what I'm going to do is read a couple of, these are two abstracts, maybe three abstracts, no, maybe more, on game theory Marxism. And I know that may sound incredibly dense and stupid, but the simple way to explain it in a nice didactic way is Ben Burgess over at Give Them an Argument has tended to write, and I think it's a straw argument, but it amuses me that he addresses Jerry Cohen, G.A. Cohen, the late G.A. Cohen, on analytic Marxism, as though you could. It's an easy argument because it's already been sort of worked through and it's moved on to other matters, which Burgess has not quite gotten there yet. So maybe he'll get there. That'll be a good thing. Um, this is a historical look, on the one hand, at the thing called analytic Marxism, G.A. Cohen being a major light in that one. But there's a body of people who discuss the matter. There's a literature, goes back 20 years at least. And yes, it was something that I was interested for a while in. It raises the same questions that we raised today. And in terms of this Blotto game that I just showed, that is, what degree of rationality do we have when we make certain kinds of choices? And if you're, the current problem, of course, is the election, and it's a watershed election. It is, at least for me, it is probably the election of a lifetime. I always tend to vote for certain parties and who have lost a majority of elections in my lifetime, but I still vote for them. Anyway, the first abstract is this paper discusses the philosophical foundations of game theoretic Marxism. Initially, the reductionist pretensions of analytic Marxism, which is practiced game theoretic Marxism, are considered and rejected. So he already is upfront about being negative about this. After advancing an anti-reductionist game theoretic formulation of Marx's theory of surplus value in terms of bilateral monopoly, problems of collective action are examined. It is recognized that during particular historical epochs, instrumental rationality may capture the process through which individual agents act. However, it is proposed that the instrumental view of rationality should not be assumed to be a trans-historical fact of human nature, and that alternate philosophical conceptions of rationality recently advanced within the game theory literature provide a more satisfactory basis for social scientific investigation. And if you've been listening to me yammer for the last couple of years, some of these questions are important about, rationality and everyday behavior. What's our belief system that kind of drives how we act? And often we make bad choices, and bad choices are not as, they're not as neutral or as free, I guess, as you want to refer to it. And that lends itself to the issue of freedom and liberty, which we actually see in the current election. You could say there is a kind of choice, and it's a complex set of choices, of course. But for example, the abortion choice has an incredible number of constraints, and it's being manipulated by a variety of parties. And you can see that, particularly because of Roe v. Wade, et cetera, and Dodd decision, that we are in, very bad state in the terms of the national federal elections. Anyway, second abstract. This paper argues that there's a new theoretical current in Western sociology. Well, it's new about a couple decades ago, game theoretic Marxism. It situates the current in what seems to be a more general paradigm shift from the mid-1970s. Paradigm shifts were BFD, and still are, but most people don't know what the hell it means. So that's a whole nother story. That is from a focus on structure. And you'll note, if you've been listening somewhat closely to what I've been doing, I tend to have begun, as with my own, sort of personal academic history, from a kind of structuralist perspective, but I've always been aware of the critique of it, and of course all of the divergences. From a focus on structure to an emphasis on agency, that is individual agents, that is people. And in sociology, during not only this period, but the current period, there are issues of structure and agency that are always involved. And there's a bunch of other things, of course, reflexivity and blah, 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 blah. But, and as more recently, I was yammering about social ontology. But anyway, in this context, we consider the debate between the new theory's foremost proponent, John Elster, and G.A. Cohen, who I just mentioned, Jerry Cohen, advocate of functional explanation. That's a whole nother set of things that perhaps needs to be unpacked. It is shown then how this new theory of collective action draws on Moncur Olson's formulations of the mid 1960s. So he has Michael Olson as a theory of collective action, which is a classic in terms of talking about certain ideas about how why is it that people get together to do stuff? After which its central tenets are developed in a discussion of two significant variants of it. Finally, the shortcomings of game theoretic Marxism are analyzed and an alternative notion of explanation by collective agency is proposed. That is, one that centers upon the causal powers of social classes and breaks with both Cohen's functionalism and Elster's intentional explanation. This alternative version, number one, can account for non-intentional causation. Now, non-intentional causation is an interesting problem because, that's kind of what we're trying to worry about with, Trump's current legal problems are a mens rea problem that we now see in the current Jack Smith submission to the court in D.C. It's trying to show that it's pretty clear that Trump knew what he was doing and what he wanted to do, and the mens rea, that is, what was going on in his brain, such as it is, was clearly about, disrupting the process and colluding with not White House people, but with people in the campaign. And that's the fundamental thing about immunity that has been raised by Trump's cronies on the Supreme Court. So that's kind of what's going on, intentional causation. And number two, in this version of GTM, that is game theory Marxism, considers social classes and other collective actors, which is what we've been talking about. If you've been listening at all to my yammering about here, is that, we've been looking at the antagonisms, the problem of the groups are unhappy with each other. And it is these antagonisms, you start with Hegel, move further and know that, we're still worried about this stuff. It is why we have wars, why people are dropping bombs on each other, et cetera, in the current context. As possessed with organizational and cultural resources. In fact, the Israel, Gaza, Iran, Hezbollah thing is, it's about organizational cultural resources and, of course, exploding pagers. It is argued that this alternative version is more fruitful for the understanding of social processes, and it contributes to the attempts to supersede the strict dichotomy. Now, the question is whether it's a strict dichotomy is a whole another set of questions, but anyway. But some people have managed to get Lord Anthony Giddens has gotten his his lordship out of the difference between structure and agency. Anyway, that's another story. Our third abstract is we reach a different conclusion, however. In particular, we believe that, this is from a big paper done by two guys at Middlebury College. And they're writing about what they call in this particular thing. And they've written this in the 21st century. So this has, on the one hand, they're just revisiting it because it's an easy topic. On the other hand, it is still, as most academics like to do, something to cogitate over. Anyway, these two guys, we reach a different conclusion, however. In particular, we believe that the recent literature in experimental economics, and experimental economics has moved in the last 30 years or so, to isolating that thing that neoclassical economics has always focused on, that is the dominant mathematical form of studying economics, has moved to try to create, particularly for certain subfields, ways in which you can test in probably a positivistic way, whether you can test certain propositions in a lab. That is, you could do an economy in a lab. Now, whether you can apply sort of lab applications, this is no different than the merging in the field of economics of certain things in behavioral science, that is psychology, with economics. And, you could say, well, there's actually no real laws in there, but there are things that have law-like capability and certainly that are manipulated by all kinds of people, like people who sell cars and other things. So they're there and you can experiment with them. Whether they work in reality, it's a whole different question. And whether they work in history is even a bigger question. But back to that. In particular, we believe that the recent literature in experimental economics, and this was led by a guy at Caltech, anyway, together with previous behavioral work outside economics, which economists now take seriously, the economists always took it seriously. It is simply the matter that the subfields have decided to overlap more, and because a couple of folks got Nobel Prizes and because the results look more quote unquote scientific than other things, and whatever. And similarly, game theoretic Marxism had that kind of element to it. It's like more math. And then the challenge to the math, well, that's capitalist math. That's not communist math. Well, it's stupid, and other stupid arguments emerged. Anyway, has moved the discipline much closer to Lubtener, they were described above in that article, and that observed behavior in the lab is much closer to Marx's conception of economic man than Homo economicus. Homo economicus is an idealized form of, that you could propose, and you could go all the way back to the Greeks to propose this, that, people are operating in a certain type of economic way. They behave economically. They maximize utility. They try to get the most out of something. Blah 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 blah. And these constructions are an interesting construction because you could say that the Soviets were trying to move, from a Marxist point of view to, optimizing what that might be, or pointing towards the future. It's a kind of modern idea. The modern Soviet man was actually an image that had a wide effect in the 20th century, the early 20th century. This does not mean, of course, that the individuals involved are not purposeful as opposed to hard-nosed. So they make this distinction between sort of hard and soft, which, phallocratic imagery aside, is just silly. But anyway, rational or often self-interested, which is the fundamental point of game theoretic Marxism, is to parse out at what moment are people just selfish, individuals acting randomly, because in some ways they still do. And, you can go on there, but whatever. Furthermore, we believe that it is, or soon will be, of course, they're writing in 2003, I think, in this article, possible 20 years ago, possible to rationalize class rational behavior in these terms, and that much of this behavior is consistent with evolutionary game theory. So the last 20 years, for a certain group of people who emerged and who are very, very smart in Marxist circles, but they're also very smart in evolutionary game theory circles. Evolutionary game theory is a multidiscipline activity. And if you were listening to our activity over with talking about Engels and ecology and that kind of stuff in the 19th century, the history, in effect, of social ecology, well, at least at one level, we can see that there's science there, and it's a good science. It's a science that has given us eco-socialism and a variety of other things. And so evolutionary game theory is a side project of that. And so these two guys decide that you're going to call it behavioral Marxism, which is good and bad because it sort of implies that the analytic stuff had a good idea. Well, maybe. But I think it raises larger philosophic questions, which I'll get to in a second. So, and there is a site for evolutionary game theory on the Stanford International whatever philosophy site called plato.stanford.edu, and goes back to R.A. Fisher, also discussed by Bellamy Foster, among others, that is that there are genetic theories of natural selection that, of course, are problematically applied when you think of eugenics and a variety of other things. But evolutionary game theory, it does, well, let me just get to it. Initially, it was thought that evolutionary game theory might provide an inroad into solving the equilibrium selection problem of traditional game theory. Although the fundamental solution concept of traditional game theory, the Nash equilibrium, and those of you who've seen the movie Beautiful Mind, this is the same Nash, John Nash. Nash equilibrium had the desirable property of always existing for any game with a finite number of players and strategies. Provided that mixed strategies were allowed, it had several deficiencies. And without getting to lecture on it, but it is important. Um, well, it's certainly a Nobel Prize thing, but it is also the idea that we never get, optimality is a fleeting matter in reality. But you still need to sort of get at certain structural elements. So that's the structural part of it. The other side of it, from an agency point of view, is to figure out, well, how rational is it, or how irrational is one's actions within this context. And without getting into a huge thing about it, it's really pretty much tit for tat or tip for tap, which is the more proper way of talking about, sort of simple 2x2 games, et cetera, et cetera. A Nash equilibrium was not guaranteed to be unique, sometimes even with uncountable many Nash equilibria existing, did not always seem to correspond to a reasonable outcome. Now, here, the reference, which I find amusing for all the usual reasons, our friend, Yanis Varoufakis, is cited here, which I find quite amusing just in general, because of all the game theory books, whoever wrote this decided they'd apply Hargreaves, Heap, and Varoufakis, which is Varoufakis' only book on game theory, but it's a good little book. It's a small, fits in your pocket actually, and it actually makes perfect sense. But it is the same guy, who's talking about minotaurs and DIEM 25, the same guy. So lest you think that Marxists are whatever, they're kind of like numbers too, and occasionally conflicted with people's intuitions as to what ought to count as a rational outcome. In contrast, it can be shown that a completely mixed evolutionary stable strategy was unique, and that there are at most only a finite number of evolutionarily stable strategies, and that several intuitive definitions of evolutionarily stability, it should be evolutionary stability, were equivalent to the original definition of Maynard Smith and Price. Maynard Smith is a single person here. It was soon realized that evolutionary game theory itself had problems structurally similar to that of the equilibrium selection problem. Several competing definitions of evolutionary stability, which is what it should have been above, were put forward, each of which had certain intuitive merit. In addition, as the connection between the static and dynamic approaches, see, that's where the equilibrium is always problematic, because much of economics is taught in and lest you think that's unimportant, it's taught in most business schools with a static model. And so dynamic approaches get really complicated. No one wants to teach that, at least undergraduates. And it is just complicated. So are explored in detail and was found that at best, an imperfect fit between static concepts of evolutionary stability and that of dynamic stability. This is similar to the issue that I was watching with Anwar Sheikh's lecture on Tuesday. He was talking at UMass online about his latest little model for examining the global economy, which is really a good model. It's just that he needs, as one can observe, an army of graduate students working on it, which were expressly irrational from the point of view of traditional game theory, such as the preservation of strictly dominated strategies. Now, a strictly dominated strategy, it is this sort of asymmetry. On the one hand, somebody's going to win, somebody's going to lose. That's oversimplifying it, but you got to think about that in an election, for example, to go all the way back to where I started. Winning an election is really important, and a tie is going to be really problematic. And it is possible under 2%, I think, or whatever it is, of the cases, and assuming that all of the electoral college votes, which is going to be the real problem on November 5th, between November 5th and January 6th, is you could have a tie. it's possible to have a tie, a problematic tie, of course. But the electoral college votes could wind up being 269, 269. But you have a really weird, a whole bunch of things have to go right, wrong, and blah, blah, blah to wind up with that. So it's unlikely that it's going to happen, but it could still happen. It would be amusing for it to happen, if only because then we would see all kinds of crazy crap going on. It is why Trump sent Lindsey Graham, of all people, to Nebraska to get their, that single electoral college vote to try and make it a GOP vote. Anyway, so if you look at the Stanford site, it has in the latter components of it a whole bunch of things on evolutionary game theory, also the philosophical problems, because the philosophical problems really are what lead the kind of structural problems of evolutionary game theory. And it's worth it talking about, and I will at some future date talk about that too as well. But let's look at the summary on the value-ladenness of evolutionary game theoretic explanations. If one seeks to use an evolutionary game theoretic model to explain the normativity attached to a social rule, that is, what one should do, how one decides what to do, one must explain how such an approach avoids committing the so-called naturalistic fallacy of inferring an ought statement from a conjunction of is statements. Now, note, of course, that ought is a fundamental moral problem that is built into it's a deontological problem. Anyway, assuming that the explanation does not commit such a fallacy, one argument charges that it must be then the case that the evolutionary game theoretic explanation merely repackages certain key value claims tacitly assumed in the construction of the model. And that's half the battle, or to me, half the battle, maybe 90% of the battle. After all, since any argument whose conclusion is a normative statement must have at least one normative statement in the premises, any evolutionary game theoretic argument purporting to show how certain norms acquire normative force must contain, at least implicitly, a normative statement in the premises. That sounds all very circular, but it's a necessary kind of assumption because often our arguments essentially are about those kinds of things. There are other people working on this problem in really interesting ways, and yes, no one cares about it, but fundamentally, you can see that some of these arguments are actually at work in everyday life, as I tried to suggest. Consequently, the application of an evolutionary game theory does not provide a neutral analysis of the norming question, but merely acts as a vehicle for advancing particular values, namely those smuggled in the premises. So in this one sentence, you can see, well, damn it, there's other stuff going on. And secondly, this criticism seems less serious than the charge of irrelevancy. Cultural evolutionary game theoretic explanation of norms need not smuggle in normative claims in order to draw normative conclusions. The theory already contains at its core a proper subtheory having normative content, namely a theory of rational choice. Now, that's a problem in which boundedly rational agents act in order to maximize, as best they can, their own self-interest. Now, the boundedness is and rational games is all part of this a larger analysis that can be applied to all kinds of behavior, including, for example, the current use at the Fed of quantitative easing. But anyway, that's another story. One may challenge the suitability of this as a foundation for normative content of certain claims, but it is a different criticism from the above charge. Although cultural evolutionary game theoretic models do act as vehicles for promulgating certain values, they wear those minimal value commitments on their sleeve, unless you think that's unimportant. And maybe a couple of weeks, I'll talk about monkeys and bananas and coconuts in trees, with due respect to Kamala Harris and the coconut hitting you in the head. Evolutionary explanations of social norms have the virtue of making their value commitments explicit and also of showing how other normative commitments, such as fair division in certain bargaining situations or cooperation in the prisoner's dilemma. Prisoner's dilemma is shown in, for example, A Beautiful Mind, may be derived from the principled action of boundedly rational, self-interested agents. So, what does this mean? So I decided I would ask Gemini, the artificial intelligence tool of Google, And yes, I know it's going to take over. It's going to dominate us all. But I should be dead by the time that happens, so I don't worry about it. Is to apply the concept not covered heavily in the Bellamy Foster book, but probably should have spent a little more time on it. But I assume Bellamy Foster will get to it at some moment, or one of his army of graduate students will do that. Evolutionary game theory and punctuated equilibrium, which is Stephen Jay Gould's. Well, Stephen Jay Gould spends time on it anyway. Are two powerful concepts in evolutionary biology that, while studied separately, can provide a more comprehensive understanding of the evolutionary process. So, just to review this, as Gemini does, evolutionary game theory, the core concept examines how strategies evolve over time based on their interactions with other strategies in a population. So this goes all the way back to my little Blotto game thing. This is about, you're in a duopoly, like a two-party system for the most part. People are fighting over, well, we need more electoral college votes. And this is, you can apply this. Payoffs are benefits and costs, alternative behaviors, population dynamics, applications, and you can model all kinds of crap, cooperation, altruism, sexual selection, even. A punctuated equilibrium proposes that evolutionary change is not always gradual. You see, the evolutionary part of evolutionary game theory suggests in some ways that after X number of, whatever things are, they evolve rather than, and it's a function of large numbers rather than having these moments. And this is the question raised in the 1970s by questions of structural change or quote unquote revolutionary change. And so a punctuated equilibrium is an example of a burst of rapid change. Now, whether you want to, get into the weeds on this, it's an interesting question, and one raised and in fact identified in a variety of biological, geological, and other things. And I will leave it to the army of graduate students, of which I have none, to apply this to some of the issues that are currently involved in eco-socialism. But anyway, so stasis is a punctuated equilibrium of things, periods of little or no evolutionary change. Nothing happens. Punctuations are short periods of rapid evolutionary change. Yeah, the giant meteor comes, right? Speciation, that is the formation of new species as a result of these punctuations, because it is applied, in the larger evolutionary applications to biology, et cetera. And then applications often used to explain the fossil record. This is a big deal for a lot of people, right? You could argue, if you were some certain religious types, there's a God somewhere, and it's his design that he comes in at the year 6000 BCE and does something. I have no idea, but it could be, he just throws a meteor at the planet, but that's another story. Anyway, it's an interesting idea. And so with these two concepts, while these two concepts seem distinct, they can be integrated to provide a more nuanced understanding of evolution. And if I were talking about this in a public school, I'd be already fired. So whatever. So the novel insight coming from Blotto games is that if you're the weaker player, you want to add dimensions, which is sort of the key to kind of stuff I'm working on. Dimensionality, what counts as dimension? And dimensionality is a very key point in, for example, making maps or mapping procedures, which are categorical mathematical procedures and blah, blah, blah. So it's an interesting example. And I just threw this in here because we are still, if you're following this guy, this guy who's actually a Stalinist, he has a reading project, or a reading schedule anyway, for all 3 volumes of Karl Marx's Capital. And so currently, if you've been following along, we should be up to volume 3 in Capital, which we aren't. We're still in volume 2 if we were, following along. And in fact, we did that last Saturday with the showing lecture number 7 by Andy Higginbottom on chapters 19 and 20 in volume 2 of Karl Marx's Capital. And you may think that that's unimportant, but it actually is kind of important. And we're going to still do that on tomorrow, perhaps. We're going to perhaps just look closer at Higginbottom's 25 slides I've made from what for Higginbottom is more than 25 slides on Toto, but that's what we'll look at tomorrow. And I've yammered enough, I think. So if there are any queries, questions, well, whatever. Israel bombed the hospital in Lebanon. Damn it. Son of a bitch. If they use the same, well, anyway. Rumble. There are no questions, comments, brickbats. No, of course. We're all baffled by this. I'm going to talk about these things in greater detail soon, but I also had included in my little presentation scheme here that I would actually go, let's see if we can do it directly or indirectly. We can visit my Daily Coast page. The thing is, today, I did it only a couple hours ago, The Art of War, or of Economic and Financial Speculation, Blotto versus Lotto. And so this is what the example looks like in terms of, these are the swing states. And this is the dominant version that's been produced from 170,000 entries. So there's 170,000 people, and it could be bots, who knows? Maybe Russians are screwing with this, so who knows? So we don't know that. But yet this is what it looks as the main one that seems to be selected, and that is Pennsylvania, Georgia, North Carolina, Michigan, Arizona, Wisconsin, and Nevada, and perhaps something out of New Hampshire, which is not the way you would read this problem anyway. And so this allows for fractional voting, which is not you don't get fractional awards of electoral votes. I think it's all it's all or nothing in terms of electoral vote totals. But anyway, unless there are, I don't know, there may be state level divisions, but I think the only ones that are Maine and Nebraska, right? Anyway, it all suggests that the Electoral College either must go or must be revised. So the one I did here, and I suggested that, if you don't get too nuts about this, it's worth doing it in this way. And the example that they use, and I find this much more interesting, is the one of the articles they use, a fairly recent article, well, not that recent, but uses Bush v. Gore of 2000, the election of 2000, as an example. And so close races are, interesting. The background to this, of course, is a guy named Emile Borel, a short paper written in 1921, over 100 years ago. And it is a kind of determined order and blah, blah, blah. But there's a 2006 paper done by a bunch of folks, one person from Claremont Graduate School and somebody someplace else, I can't remember. Might have been Harvard, who knows? But the Colonel Blotto game can be rerun. And, that's just what academics do, is rerun old stuff. And so there's this 2006 paper. They argue, for example, that Gore's hairbreadth loss to Bush in 2000 was due to mistakes in his blotto strategy. Now, what were those mistakes? I'll mention that in a second here. A 2014 paper by two economists spends 20 pages on blotto maths before concluding that more work would yield insights into more complicated variants of the game, which may be more representative of real military, political, or other environments. In other words, blotto is still a useful game. I mean, at one level, you can model the Ukrainian war, for example. I include in this particular instance a little video by some guy at Michigan on applying the blotto game to the Electoral College. He has a slightly different version of that, but one thing referenced in the 2014 paper is the comparison of the 2000 election. And the 2000 election was one of the closest races in recent history following the debacle in Florida. Professional and armchair pundits, I raised my hand, alike were quick to point out the flaws in Gore's campaign strategy, given the impression that such mistakes were avoidable. We argue that these so-called mistakes were not avoidable, since the candidates were playing a blotto game. And so, as such, while Gore could have utilized a strategy that would have won the election, such a strategy was not identifiable ex ante after the fact. However, we argue that the 1996 election be classified as a forerunner game, which is not a blotto game. Bill Clinton had a sizable advantage over Dole, such that no ex post change, or ex ante is before, I'm sorry, ex post is after, change in Dole's strategy could have changed the outcome of the 1996 election, as we observed Clinton playing a pure strategy to sure victory. We are not the first to draw the blotto electoral college likeness to attention, but we are the first to tackle this complexity head on. Well, yes and no. But I included the Wikipedia version in here, and the conclusion: media organizations later analyzed the ballots and found that under specified criteria, the original limited recount of undervotes of several large counties would have resulted in a Bush victory. This is where the negotiating went all stupid. And if I'm going to blame anybody, you can blame Gore, but you can also blame David Boyce, who did the primary front-end negotiation on this and argued the case before the Supreme Court. Though a statewide recount would have shown that Gore received the most votes, according to the Florida Ballot Project. And then, of course, the results. And then I include the application that you can use pretty much to, the Gemini example to compare the blotto game, or apply the blotto game to Russia-Ukraine, gives you this kind of solution. And more interesting, of course, is that there are 3 fronts rather than 25, which really are about 25 fronts. But they devolved down to 3, which does not include the current incursion into Kursk, which actually creates an interesting problem. But anyway, Eastern Front is Donbass, Luhansk. Southern Front is Kherson, Zaporizhia, where the nuclear reactor is and all the dams and the Dnieper River and blah, blah, blah. And the Northern Front, which was that brief little new incursion that the Russians made towards to try to get, not only the capital Kyiv, but also Kharkiv. And so that's kind of the Northern Front. That's where the Kursk thing is. So that's kind of, so there are strategies, there's problems of, oversimplification. Colonel Blotto, the game does not account for factors like terrain, logistics, morale, or external support. And so, it simplifies the game, but on the other hand, it's just really complicated and involves all kinds of crazy crap, like glide bombs and air defense and, all kinds of stuff like that. And it is dynamic, right? You can't do this in a static way. And, I write every night to try and give a kind of static snapshot of where a couple of days old in terms of informational detail, what the war looks like. And I do it primarily to show that it is a dynamic model, or that it is a dynamic war. It always is. And that these static looks at it are often incredibly problematic, but we need to have them because they tell us something, even in the static model. So that's pretty much what I was yammering about. Some people liked it, most people didn't, because somebody actually commented. There's this crazy guy who's actually in Connecticut. I think he's in New London, and he and I occasionally get into arguments about Opus Dei. But anyway, because he doesn't want his Catholicism challenged. He doesn't say that explicitly, but he has a thing about being a Catholic, but he doesn't want to reveal that. It's really interesting whenever we actually have real conversations. But anyway, in military terms, this strategy mimics following the doctrine of choosing a particular point of maximum effort and then reinforcing success built around the results in that theater of operations. On the defense, It reflects the doctrine that a person who attempts to defend everything will defend nothing. Resource allocation in any human endeavor is always difficult to assess because the opponent also has a choice in how much needs to be allocated. So yes, it's sort of these beating to death the obvious, but I will be nice to him, and I will. Oh, I can't. I can't even compliment him in this form. I will later on, however. Uh, anyway, I think I've got to the end of my yammering. Do you have things to say? Otherwise, I'll get the hell off here. Anyone? No, no one cares. Oh, thank you, Kelly. The Firmament of Time by Lauren Isley. Uh, yes, yes, yes. That's an instrumental argument there. Not off base. Darwinian theory has certain elements that are problematic, but still generally holds. Uh, oh, too dense. Sorry. Tried to make it as simple as possible. Ultimately, everything is still rock, paper, scissors. Uh, I think nobody else has wanted to ask any interesting questions, or not interesting questions, just questions. Joe, you can cut the feed. Thank you very much. I will be at this stand on 5 o'clock on Monday. Tomorrow is Weekly Marks, and we'll be on a slightly different path, but part of it will be to support the visit by what's his name, Carlos Lapis Vitas or whatever. Has written a thing on the 2008 financial crisis in the United States. Well, the global crisis, the Great Recession, so-called Great Recession. And he's going to be visiting the Class Unity folks, and there's a Zoom event for that at 1 o'clock Eastern Time on Sunday. So we might do a little prep for that. Also, next week, Michael Hudson, who wrote the book on killing the host that we've been plodding through for the last couple of weeks, is going to be at Class Unity at 6 o'clock on something, whatever. We have it in Discord and somewhere else at Class Unity on Thursday, I think, on the 10th. And the author himself will be around for people to ask nasty questions or whatever. So I urge you to be there, be square. He is one of the handful of people who's given us sort of the key versions of how modern money theory works. And I will say that I like modern money theory for what it does for a monetary system. I don't like what it does for certain other things that it just simply doesn't. Well, it's not their job to do it, so that's fine. But I do think that it's actually viable. It could work if politicians would only study it further. I mean, what I'd like to do is have somebody at the Fed actually tackle this and just write a little paper on it and try and really tackle it close, and then hopefully it would gain a little bit of momentum. I may actually do that because well, with respect, I know someone at the Fed, so I think I may actually write them and tell them could you look at this? So anyway, righto. Joe, cut the feed before I get my